a warm welcome to Chloë of the Midnight Storytellers. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And it's an absolute delight to be doing this. I may or may not leave the glasses on, but yeah, I'm looking at a couple of things. Most of you know me through the cat thing. But a lot of you don't know that what I've done for the last 20 years is to perform as a storyteller. In England, most people think of storytelling as something for little people, you know, 5-year-olds, babies. I do the grown-up versions. And the only other thing I want to tell you before I start is none of this is scripted. I mean, almost anything can happen in the next 45 to 50 minutes. My work is rooted in folk tales and legends, so traditional stories, and then I reimagine them for modern audiences. And I wanted to start this morning's session with a story from, well, just up the road from where I'm living at the moment, a story from the city of Worcester. And some of you know it as Worcester in the county of Worcestershire, which is where the source comes from. But of course, the other thing that Worcester has long been famous for is porcelain, Worcester porcelain. And you can imagine that in the heyday of Worcester porcelain, the factory there, the city was practically awash with broken pieces of gorgeous crockery. I mean, the colors, the designs, the rich colors, and it was everywhere. And in those old days, there was a scrap merchant. And he used to drive his old horse and cart around the city, collecting stuff that people were throwing away. It was a very early form of recycling. And yes, he got bits of furniture, and yes, he got pots and pans. But what he got most of was broken crockery. At home, the scrap merchant had a very talented daughter. She was one of these people, and I actually know someone very like her. She was one of these people who could mend things, who could adapt things. If you gave her a sharp knife and a pot of glue and sometimes needle and there wasn't a lot she couldn't mend or remake. And then her dad would take what she'd done and sell it for very good money at Worcester Market. In particular, she had a talent with the smashed porcelain. She would pick and paste and stick those pieces together. She'd make picture surrounds, she'd make mirror frames, she'd make little mosaic stands for hot pots, she'd make mosaic tabletops, she'd make out of broken pieces new figurines. And her work was so creative, so beautiful, that it sold extremely well. So, of course, her father wanted her staying at home. He didn't want her going out at all. He didn't want her getting noticed as she blossomed into the flowering of her womanhood. He didn't want her going out and getting noticed by any likely lads. So it was about this time of year, and that poor young woman was stuck in the dingy back kitchen of her father's house, sitting at the kitchen table with a huge pile of broken crockery and a big pot of glue, picking and pasting and sticking, and a little bit of bird song and a little bit of summer sunshine squeezed through that grubby window, but not very much. The pieces on that table in front of her were not what you'd usually find in Worcester. This had been some kind of superb tea set. It was blue, it was white, it had flecks of gold. It was very elegant. And the young woman was picking and pasting and sticking and dreaming of love. She worked for a good 3 hours. And then she stopped to look at what she'd made, because She'd done that work for so long, for so many years. She didn't really have to think about what her hands were doing. She was just picking and pasting and sticking and dreaming of love. And then she stopped, and then she looked, and then she saw that what she'd made was a life-size man. Oh, yes, a life-size man, correct in every anatomical detail. Honestly, he looked as if he could be fully functional. And then as she gazed admiringly at her handiwork,
sorry about that.
How long have I been muted?
Just 1 second. You're good. Go right where you were.
So after those 3 hours, she stopped to look at what she'd made, and it was this life-size man. And as she admired her handiwork, those porcelain blue eyes opened, and a gold-edged mouth smiled and opened, and the porcelain man spoke. My sweetheart, my love, at last you have found me. Come to my arms. Well, she didn't need telling twice. She stepped into the porcelain man's embrace, and with just a little cracking, chinking sound, he closed his arms around her, and for the first time in her life, she got kissed. And she liked it. She liked it a lot. She put her back into it, and he was just about getting into his stride. I mean, she was sitting up on the kitchen table, and her skirts were getting right up round her hips, when the door flung open, and there was her father standing in the doorway. He took one look, he took one step, and with his big red fist, he smashed the porcelain man down, and pieces shattered and flew in all directions across the kitchen. And then the father slapped his daughter down to the floor and turned and stormed out of the kitchen and slammed the door behind him and turned the key in the lock. The girl lay on the floor. She lay silent. She knew better than to get her father's attention back to her after he'd lost his temper. But as soon as his footsteps faded away, she picked herself up, went to the sink, bathed the bruise with cold water, and looked around her. And all across the kitchen floor were fragments and pieces of that porcelain with blue and white and flecks of glinting gold. And then on one of the pieces, a porcelain blue eye winked at her. And there was the mouth, the gold-edged mouth, still smiling. My sweet, my love, fear nothing. It is midsummer, my magic is strong. Stick me together again in the shape of a horse and get on my back, and I will carry you away from everything you have ever known, and you and I can be together and love each other forever. Well, the girl didn't need telling twice. She, faster than she'd ever worked in her life, she was picking and pasting and sticking, and within an hour she'd made, well, actually there were so many broken pieces, broken so small that all she had enough to do was she made a 12-2 hand porcelain pony. It was gorgeous. It had a crinkly, flowing, gold-flecked mane and tail. It had a blue and white, delicate porcelain hoof that pawed the ground impatiently. And she got on its back, and it walked astride, it trotted astride, it cantered one stride, and it jumped clean out through the kitchen window and landed skidding on the cobbles outside. The girl flung her arms around its neck, and that porcelain pony bolted down the street. It clattered over the cobbles. Children screamed and shouted and chased it, but no one could catch the porcelain pony as it pounded through Worcester Market and around the cathedral and across the bridge over the river and out into the country lanes. And those of you who've ridden bolting ponies and horses, as I have, you know that you just sit there praying it won't turn too sharp a corner and sitting up as straight as you can and hoping it doesn't throw you off. And then eventually the wretched creature slows down and you can sit up and catch your breath. They slowed and they stopped in a country lane, well outside Worcester. There was a bend in the road and a big old oak tree on that corner. The porcelain pony turned its head on its neck to look back at the girl riding it, again with just that slight cracking, chinking sound. And the porcelain pony said, "Now, my dear, I need you to be braver than you've ever been. You see that tree at the corner? I want you to ride me headlong into that tree trunk and smash me to pieces again." Well, by then the girl was used to doing as she was told. She nudged the pony into a walk, a trot, a canter, headlong, gallop, smash, crash, shatter. She, and some of us know this trick, she just remembered to throw herself off and roll at the last minute, and she picked herself up, and there were porcelain pieces all along the roadside, and on one of them, there was half the golden porcelain mouth. "Now, my dear, stick me together again as a man, and you and I can be together and love each other forever." And that was when the young woman burst into tears. She'd forgotten to bring the glue, and she sat there at the roadside. She gathered the pieces up into her skirt, and she was sobbing as if her little heart were broken. And while she sat there, you know, she was such a young and gorgeous young lady, the sort of person who can cry, who can sob with no snot and no red eyes. I begin to go off her at this point. And as she sat there, from down the lane coming towards her, she heard thubbity thud, thubbity thud. There was a real big brown horse being ridden by a rather nice looking young man, you know, with a big dramatic white shirt and a clean face and nice hair and very tight breeches. But the most important thing about him was that as he rode up to the young woman sitting there, he looked down with the kindest, gentlest expression, and he reined in his horse and he said, "I can see you're in trouble. Is there anything I can do to help you?" And she looked up at him and she said, "I'm running away, but my true love is broken. I haven't got any glue." The young man was a bit taken aback and he said, "So you need some glue?" "Yes." "Well, I can help you with that. If you will let me take you back to my father's manor house, the servants will bring as much glue as you want." "Oh, thank you." And then the young man jumped off his horse and he scooped all the porcelain pieces into the saddlebag. And then he scooped the young woman up in his arms, and that was no mean feat. She had plenty of curves, and he put her on the saddle, and then athletically he vaulted up behind her and he reached around her to pick up the horse's reins. Where the porcelain man had been cold and unyielding, the squire's son, oh, she could feel there were muscles moving under that shirt, and his arms, all of him. He was warm and yes, there was a scent of clean, healthy young man. I can just about remember that. And as they rode away together down the lane, the young woman was thinking. It came to the manor's house, and the squire's son was as good as his word. In a few minutes, they were both sat opposite each other at the kitchen table with the pile of porcelain fragments and a big pot of glue. And they sat and they talked and they worked together, picking and pasting and sticking. And as they worked and talked, they gazed into each other's eyes, and often, as they reached out for pieces, their fingertips touched. After about 3 hours or so, they stopped to look at what they'd made, and what the two of them had made between them was exquisite, blue and white with flecks of glinting gold, a very handsome, complete porcelain tea service. And there it was all stacked up at the end of the table. On one of the teacups, a pair of porcelain blue eyes opened and blinked sadly. On the saucer, there was the gold-edged porcelain mouth that turned down and opened. My sweetheart, my love, I thought you and I were going to be together forever. Have you forgotten me so soon? That sudden appearance of magic obviously startled the young woman, because she jumped to her feet and her gesture of astonishment, her hands flew out and quite accidentally knocked that cup and saucer flying off the end of the table. And of course, the young woman sprang forward, obviously meaning to save that cup and saucer. And of course it was by accident completely that her hobnail boot pounded down hard on that cup and saucer, smashing them to irreparable white porcelain dust. A few weeks later, there was a wedding. Everyone was invited, even the grumpy old dad. And you know what it's like. Some of you go to these parties. You have a fabulous time and you booze and you chatter and you dance and it's wonderful. And then right at the end of it all, what do you need? You need a cup of tea. And at the wedding, tea was served in Granny's green and pink and white Worcester porcelain classic service. The blue and white and gold set, every piece on the order of the squire's son, every piece had been stacked on a tray, and servants had carried it all to the topmost furthest attic of the manor house and locked the lot in a cupboard, never to see the light of day again. Thank you. Thank you very much. That is one of my favorite stories. I originally thought, good morning, Louise. Give us a wave. I originally thought that story was a folktale, but apparently it's a written story somewhere. The way we storytellers collect our material, anybody else would be accused, anyone else would be accused of plagiarism. In storytelling, we call it the oral tradition. So you hear something and then you take it away and you kind of absorb it and you reimagine it, I think is my best word for that. And you retell it in your own words. That's the key. You don't just copy what someone else has done. You tell it your way. So I did promise I'd include a cat story in this set. So this is one I haven't had a chance to tell for a while. And I've heard it set in many different places. This is the other thing that storytellers do. We hear these wonderful traditional pieces and we set them in places that our audience might know or that are more connected to us as the teller. So this next story I heard originally told in and for Shropshire, but I've set it on the site of an old monastery down the road from here in the little town of Malmesbury, right on the edge of the Cotswolds. because in the long ago, when stories were being made, Malmesbury Abbey was one of the big ones. They were famous throughout the land for their piety, for taking in superfluous young men and giving them a home and a purpose and educating them. And of course, Malmesbury Abbey turned out the most gorgeous illuminated manuscripts. They had a huge scriptorium, and I've seen some of the work that was done there. But it was, as the storytellers say, it was a dark and stormy night. And there was one young monk, all on his own in the great church of Malmesbury Abbey. And it was the middle of the night. And his job was to prepare everything, to sweep the floor and light the candles and make sure everything was tidy for whatever service, and I've forgotten the name of it, that the monks had to get up and attend in the middle of the night. It was always the most junior monk's task to do that. And the candle flames were flaring and guttering in the drafts, and the thunder was booming outside and lightning across the sky. And he was all on his own in that huge, shadowy, echoing space. And as he swept, pushing his broom past the great doors, he heard a sound from outside. He heard, and he wasn't quite sure what it was. So in the great door, in these churches, there's always a little sort of postern door. So he pushed that open against the wind and the rain, and he looked out and there was no one there. And it was down there. And of course, sitting in a puddle, completely bedraggled, was a kitten, a small kitten that looked up at him with its blue eyes and said, it was soaked and it was shivering and sneezing. Without a second thought, the monk scooped up the kitten and kind of wrung it out a bit and tucked it into his sleeve. I mean, no one was supposed to have pets in the monastery, but he would not leave a kitten out in a storm. So he got through this service and he got through the night, and he took the kitten back to his monk's cell, that's what they call the tiny little rooms that they had to live in. And he got this thing tucked up in his blankets, and you know what it's like when they're hungry. Not only was he not supposed to have a pet, but then he had to break another rule. He had to break a commandment. He had to go down to the kitchens and steal food for the kitten. And this went on for quite some time. And then, of course, the kitten got out into the monastery and the abbey and the gardens. And at first, people pretended to ignore it. But as soon as the kitten, whom he called Tom, as soon as it got big enough, it started earning its keep. Little black and white kitten growing into a sturdy young cat, and young Tom turned out to be a superb mouser. And it was just as well, because the abbey, the monastery, was suffering, as everyone did in those days, from waves and plagues of mice and rats. They chewed the copes and the vestments, they nibbled at the expensive vellum, they drank the ink, they nibbled the brushes and they ate everything. And any bit of food left out, they had. So young Tom was made quite welcome. And the years went by, and young Tom became old Tom. Old Tom still loved a cuddle. Most of all, he loved to cuddle that monk who was now quite senior himself. But anyone who cuddled old Tom had to do it carefully, because if you squeezed old Tom a bit too tight, there'd be an awful smell and possibly a distressing noise. and possibly something worse. Old Tom still liked to climb the apple tree in the quadrangle because that was the best place for catching some sunlight and not getting trodden on, and also watching the business of the monastery and the abbey as people, visitors and monks alike, walked around the cloisters. It was very sheltered, it was warm, and he could see everything and everybody. But of course, as an older cat, Tom, some of you know how this goes, he could climb up with those old claws of his, and he could get comfy on a branch and woe betide any bird that landed anywhere near him. But when it came to coming down, it's always more difficult for a cat to get down from a tree. And old Tom, oh yeah, twinges. And so he took to calling for help when the time came to climb down from his perch. And he would call for his preferred human. And he would call like this. Which rather disturbed the business of the monastery, and honestly it would make the scribes in the scriptorium scratch a terrible mistake across that expensive parchment. People would drop things, the service in the church would be interrupted, and worst of all, the abbot would be disturbed from his afternoon nap. So the monk who was in charge of old Tom, he learned to run. He learned to drop what he was doing and run to fetch old Tom down from the tree. And what a business it was. It's bad enough trying to climb up a tree, but imagine having a monk's habit on with the long brown fabric and a great big rope. And it was a nightmare until the monk worked out a trick, and it was terribly simple. When Tom called, the monk would run out to the tree and grab hold of a branch and hold it down, and the cat would come walking down the branch and onto his arm, dig all claws into the man's shoulder and jump down. This was all right, but some nights the monk would pray, Lord, Tom's had a good life. He's earned his keep. But now it's not so easy for him, and he's not as well as he used to be. So, Lord, don't you think it's time for him to go to his rest? Can't you see, Lord, a way to take old Tom up to heaven? But there seemed to be no answer to that prayer. And then one day, the monk, senior as he was, had to take his turn doing the washing up in the kitchen that overlooked the quadrangle. And the monk was up to his elbows in hot soapy water when out in the tree, in the quadrangle, Tom called for his help down to the ground. And the monk dropped everything, didn't even stop to dry his hands, and ran out into the quadrangle before the entire life of the abbey and the monastery was disrupted. And he grabbed the branch and he held it down, and the cat started walking towards him when the monk's soapy, slippery hand could no longer hold that branch, and the branch swoosh whipped out of his hand and flung up into the air and catapulted old Tom high, high and higher, clean over the abbey wall. And the monk was horrified. Lord, I wanted you to take old Tom up to heaven, but not like that. He was distraught and no one could comfort him. And they all rushed outside to look for the cat, and they couldn't find him at all. And days went past, and finally the other monks got together and talked to the vicar from the church in the town. And the vicar, at the end of the week, brought in a little ginger and white kitten, and they gave it, everyone gave the kitten to the monk. Lord, you do know how to punish a man. All right, I'll take care of this one too. And the vicar, that afternoon, sure that he had done a good deed, waved goodbye to the monks and left the abbey and walked into the town high street past the splendid new stone memorial. And who should he see coming towards him but old Mrs. Winter. Now, old Mrs. Winter was one of those women you normally crossed the street to avoid her, a toothless, grumbling, bad-tempered, foul-mouthed old crone. I admire her enormously. But that day, old Mrs. Winter was shuffling along, carrying quite a heavy basket with a blanket in it, and she was smiling. It was years since the vicar had seen her smile. And as they approached each other, the vicar realized that something under that blanket in the basket was moving. And then a whiskery old grey head popped up with moth-eaten ears. You know what I mean. And the vicar recognized that old cat. And he said to the old woman, "Mrs. Winter, where did you get that cat?" And the woman said, "Well, vicar, you know how I've been miserable since my husband died, and I asked you to bring me a cat to keep me company. And you brought me that ginger and white kitten, didn't you? And the blooming thing got under my feet and tripped me up and nearly broke my neck. So I told you to take it away, and you did. And then after that, I was more miserable and lonelier than ever. So I've been praying up to God, see? And I this morning, I was out in a veg patch, you know, weeding my carrots. And I was praying up to the Lord. I said, Lord, I hope it's not too much to ask, but all I want is a nice old cat, a nice old quiet cat that me and him can sit together and be company for each other to the end of our days. And I honestly, vicar, no sooner had I finished praying than up in the sky I hear this noise, a kind of a row coming down out the sky. And I look up and I held out my arms, and that cat came flying down out the sky and landed in my arms. And he looked at me and I look at him, and we knew we was just right for each other. So I've been into town this morning to get him a few things, and we are going to be comfy. And that, my friends, is the story of the Monastery Moggie, who lived happily ever after. Thank you. Yes, you can tell I've been well trained, can't you, with the sound effects. I hope none of your creatures were upset by that. I've known a few cats react to that sound. All right, where are we? Oh my goodness me. I'd like to do another story. Give me a thumbs up if that's okay. All right, okay. Actually, yes, we did start a little bit late, didn't we? And also I'm running my watch. I have to remember, I keep my watch running 5 minutes fast, so I've got half a chance of being somewhere on time. All right. The other thing that I am, I was going to say known for, yes, all right, notorious. I'm a bit obsessed with dragons, as I think you've seen on several occasions. And in fact, where I live here in the Cotswolds, near Cheltenham and Gloucester, and if you go a little bit further west, you cross the River Severn and you go past the Forest of Dean, and then you're into Wales. I mean, it only takes barely an hour to get into Wales. And that is where this next story comes from. And this really is a grand old folk tale. From the time when stories were being made in the long ago, in Wales, there was a king called Vortigern. King Vortigern had a number of nasty habits. As was common in those days, he hardly ever washed, he never brushed his teeth, and he had the kind of beard that birds could happily have nested in. If you look closely at Vortigern's beard, actually that would be a really bad idea, because in the beard were bits and pieces and dregs and oozings of most of last month's breakfasts. Ugh. And King Vortigern was a coward. There were things to be afraid of in those times. In particular, of course, the Vikings were raiding Britain back in those times. They worked their way all around the shores of Britain, from the northeast down to the southwest, and on their way they raided into Wales. Vortigern wanted a castle to hide in. He chose a hill to build the castle on. He got the builders in. He said to the builders, I want you to build us, hang on, I've got to get that grammar right. We want you to build us a splendid, strong castle, and if you do it well, we shall pay you in silver and gold. If you do a bad job, we'll have your heads chopped off. The builders smiled. The builders were terrifically confident. They said, Your Majesty, will do you the best castle in all of Wales. And so they got materials in, and on the first day, they set to work. They worked well, they worked carefully, they worked fast. At the end of the very first day, they'd dug as much foundations as anybody ever did in those old times and laid a few courses of stone. And they went home for their tea that night feeling well pleased with themselves. But when they came back on site the next morning, everything they had done, every stone they had put up, every piece of scaffolding, everything had fallen down. Do you think the king was happy? The king was furious. You builders are no use. Guards, take them away and have their heads chopped off. The builders said, Your Majesty, please spare us. This is unusual. We don't understand what's happening, but please give us a second chance. Unusually, King Vortigern allowed these people a second chance, and they set to, and with great skill and speed, that second day, the builders put up a lot of stone. But next morning, they came back on site. Everything they'd done the day before was fallen, tumbled, scattered right across the hilltop. The king roared for the guards, take these useless builders away and have their heads chopped off. The builders flung themselves on their knees in front of the king. Your Majesty, please don't have our heads chopped off. It must be magic. There must be evil magic at work here. For once in his life, King Vortigern listened. And he summoned his advisors, his wise men. It's always wise men, isn't it? You know, more robes, yes, and more beards. And they couldn't do magic to say, they didn't understand magic, but of course they had to pretend that they could. And Vortigern commanded them to understand why his castle walls were falling down. So the wise advisors went off and pretended to cast spells, and they lit a fire and they looked into the swirl of flame and the rise of smoke. They went down to the river. They gazed into the flow of the current and the patterns in the sand of the riverbed. They came back to the king and they said, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, you must find a boy who has no father and give his blood to the stones. They always talked like that when they spoke to the king. They wanted the king to think that they were important and impressive and magical, which you can tell they were not. You must find a boy who has no father and give his blood to the stones. The king called for the captain of his army and commanded him to ride out and bring a boy who had no father. And the captain of the army was horrified. The captain was a brave young man. He was happy to work for the king, to defend the king from Vikings. The captain and the army would fight Vikings for breakfast, lunch, and tea, but none of them was ready to hurt any little boys. But they had to obey their king. So they rode out. And it was on a morning of heavy rain. I tell you, in Wales, it rains. A morning of pouring rain. The captain had got separated from the groups that were riding through the valleys and around the mountains of Wales. The captain, alone on his horse, splashed and plodded along a track into a remote village, just a collection of scruffy huts and the stink of goats and wood smoke. And a gang of children ran across the track in front of him, big kids chasing a little boy out in front. And the little boy was the thinnest, scruffiest, muddiest, tousle-haired lad you've ever seen. When the big kids saw the captain on his horse, they stopped and turned and ran the other way. The little lad out in front also stopped and turned and looked up at the captain. And the captain saw that this little lad had different colored eyes, one blue eye, one green eye. And in the old days, people believed that any creature with different colored eyes had magic about them. And the kids had been shouting. They'd been shouting cruel names at this little lad, and they'd been shouting, Emrys. Emrys has no father. Na, 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 na. Emrys has no father. Na, 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 na. And the captain's heart sank. This little lad, name of Emrys, this was the one he had to catch and take back to King Vortigern, and a horrible fate at the sight of the castle. But Emrys grinned. One blue eye, one green eye, and a grin right across his grubby little face. And the boy said to the captain, We mustn't keep the king waiting. Go on, pick me up and let's go. The captain was so surprised he nearly fell off his horse. How did the boy know anything about what was going on? As if in a dream, the captain took Emrys by his rain-sodden shoulders and picked him up and plonked him on the horse in front of him, turned around and rode all the way back to the top of the hill where King Vortigern and the wise advisors and the builders were all waiting. As soon as they got there, no one even mentioned who the king was, and Vortigern wasn't wearing his crown. It was a Wednesday. And the boy jumped down and ran straight to King Vortigern, bowed very politely, and looked the king straight in the eye. He said, Your Majesty, you don't need to give anybody's blood to the stones. It's a load of rubbish. But I can tell you why your castle walls fall down. It's like this, see? About 1,000 years ago, some bloody fool locked 2 dragons in a box and put that box in the cave in the lake under this hill we're standing on now. And those dragons, they don't like being in a box, see? Would you? No. So those dragons in the box every night, they fight. And that fight shakes the waters of the lake, and that shakes the hill, that shakes the very ground we're standing on now. And that is why your castle walls are falling down. So, Your Majesty, if I may suggest, It's time for someone to open up the hill and drain the lake and let those dragons out of the box and see what happens. See? It's a big box, mind you. It's as big as well, I was going to say, it's as big as a rugby field, but you haven't invented rugby yet. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth would Vortigern begin to believe a story like that? But it was such an extraordinary story that he did believe it. And King Vortigern commanded the builders to open up the hillside, and sure enough, there was a lake, and they opened up the hill some more, and the waters came gushing and pouring out and drained away, and there was the edge of a vast grey lead box. Everybody, the builders, even the wise men and the whole of the army got around one side of the box and began to push up the lid, and it slid with a slow scraping, grinding noise. Black claws hooked over one edge, flame spouted out of the other end. Then the lid was sliding all by itself, and a vast red dragon climbed up onto the edge of the box and shook out scarlet wings with the sound of 1,000 leather coats flapping. And it stretched free after 1,000 years. At the other end of the box, a shining, gleaming white dragon emerged, hauling itself claw by foot, by wingtip, by claw onto the edge of the box, and like a great scaly cat, after 1,000 years, for the first time, it could stretch out in full, and then both dragons saw each other, hissing and spouting flame. The dragons flew up, spiraling into the air above the hilltop where they fought, scratching, biting, swinging their tail spikes at each other. And neither one could prevail until the red dragon, a bit stronger, a bit bigger and faster, flew up, looped over, dived down, and bit into the white dragon's shoulder, which screeched and tore itself away, turned tail, and flew low and fast across the border mountains into England, where it was a very long time before anyone saw it again, and that's another story. The red dragon was victorious. It hovered in the air and roared in triumph, a sound that echoed and re-echoed along the valleys and over the mountains of Wales. And that red dragon is the one you see on the Welsh flag to this very day. Vortigern got his castle, but it didn't do him any good. The Vikings caught up with him after a couple of years. Little Emrys, oh yes, one blue eye, one green eye, he definitely was a creature of magic. And when he grew up, he became the greatest wizard that the Isles of Britain have ever known. He became the friend of King Arthur, and we remember him by his professional name as the wizard Merlin. And that is the story of the Red Dragon of Wales. Thank you very much.